The evening air had a heavy stillness, almost like it was holding its breath, and the faint hum of the city outside seemed distant, muffled by the thick curtains drawn across the windows. The room was dimly lit, a soft amber glow from the single lamp in the corner, casting long shadows across the walls. Every movement felt magnified in that quiet, from the subtle shifting of a chair to the delicate creak of floorboards underfoot. He stood by the window for a long moment, staring at the streets below, as if trying to find clarity in the chaotic blur of passing headlights and scattered pedestrians. His hands gripped the edge of the windowsill tightly, knuckles whitening, betraying the calm mask he tried to hold. I noticed him there, the way his shoulders tensed and then slowly slumped, as if some invisible weight had pressed down on him. There was a momentary pause, the kind that stretches seconds into eternities, and I could feel the atmosphere thickening around us. He hadn't said a word, but his presence spoke volumes, the kind of silent language that conveys more than any conversation ever could. Every subtle glance, the brief furrow of his brow, the way his eyes seemed to dart to the floor before catching mine, they carried 1,000 unspoken truths, and I felt each one resonate deep in my chest. The scent of his cologne lingered, faint but unmistakable, mixing with the earthy aroma of rain that had begun to fall outside. The patter of droplets against the windowpane created a rhythm, almost hypnotic, and I found myself drawn into the cadence, each tap echoing the uncertainty that hung between us. I could sense his struggle, the way he inhaled sharply, the micro-expressions flickering across his face that betrayed a battle with himself. It was as if he were walking a fine line between restraint and surrender, and every second the tension grew more palpable, pressing against my own sense of control. I moved slightly, and the soft brush of my sleeve against his arm made him start, his eyes locking onto mine with a vulnerability I hadn't seen before. There was hesitation in his gaze, a mixture of longing and fear, and it pulled at something inside me I hadn't fully acknowledged. Words remained unnecessary. The silence itself was loaded, and yet heavy with expectation. Every subtle shift of his weight, every shallow breath he drew, seemed amplified, like the room had narrowed down to just the two of us, a fragile bubble suspended in time. In that space, emotions twisted and turned, raw and unfiltered, leaving us both exposed in ways that neither had anticipated. And as the night stretched on, the combination of silence, the rain, the soft golden light, and the tension in the air created an intensity that neither of us could ignore. Each second felt like a choice, each glance like a spark, and in that fragile, electric quiet, I realized that nothing would ever feel the same again. The rain outside had picked up, drumming more insistently against the window, a steady rhythm that mirrored the rapid pulse in my chest. Every drop seemed to echo the unspoken tension between us, filling the room with a kind of urgent intimacy that was impossible to ignore. He had shifted closer without a word, the air between us narrowing until it felt almost tangible, a pressure that made it difficult to breathe. I could see the slight tremor in his hands as he ran them over the back of his neck, a subtle but unmistakable sign of the inner battle waging beneath his calm exterior. There was a vulnerability in him I hadn't noticed before, a quiet unraveling that made me both apprehensive and intensely aware of every detail of his presence. His gaze met mine, and for a moment it felt like the world outside had ceased to exist. The lamp's glow highlighted the tension in his jaw, the tight line of his lips, the way his eyes flickered with emotions too complex to name. I noticed the faint curl of a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, and yet it was enough to send a rush of conflicting feelings through me, longing, curiosity, caution, and a strange thrill that neither of us could name aloud. The subtle shift of his weight as he moved closer caused my heart to stutter, each step deliberate and measured, but carrying a weight that made it clear he was teetering on the edge of restraint. I could feel the heat radiating off him, the subtle warmth that contrasted sharply with the cool air from the window, and the faint scent of rain. Dampened earth mixed with his cologne filled my senses in a way that was almost overwhelming. The room felt smaller, the walls pressing inward, each shadow stretching to envelop us. Every movement, every glance, every shallow breath carried a significance that was almost suffocating. The tension was no longer something external. It had seeped into my own skin, into my muscles and bones, leaving me acutely aware of his nearness and the fragility of the moment. Our conversation had dwindled to nothing more than the occasional soft sound, a cough, a swallowed breath, the scrape of a chair against the floor. And yet, in that silence, communication was more potent than words could ever convey. Each subtle gesture, the tilt of a head, the slight hesitation in his steps, spoke volumes. My own heartbeat seemed to respond in kind, quickening, slowing, stuttering, caught in the same rhythm as his shifting emotions. It was a dance of restraint and surrender, a silent acknowledgement of the gravity of the night, of the choices hovering on the edge of possibility. I felt my hand brush against his almost accidentally, and he didn't pull away. Instead, he froze, the smallest shiver running through him, and for a fleeting moment, the intensity between us became almost unbearable. The world had reduced to the warmth, the scent, the quiet electric tension, and the shared, unspoken awareness that something had shifted irreversibly. The rain outside blurred the edges of reality, turning everything into a soft, liquid haze. And in that haze, it was impossible to deny the depth of the emotions swelling quietly but insistently between us. The night had a weight, and we both felt it pressing down, pressing in, and leaving no room for pretense or hesitation. The room had grown quieter somehow, the rain now a soft background murmur, like a distant drum fading into the night. The tension that had been thick in the air felt different now, less urgent yet heavier, as if every unspoken thought and emotion had settled between us, tangible and unyielding. He sat on the edge of the chair, shoulders slightly hunched, eyes fixed on the floor, and I could see the flicker of conflict in his expression, the kind that comes when someone is grappling with feelings too powerful to ignore, but too fragile to fully express. Each inhale he drew seemed measured, deliberate, as though he were trying to summon courage while resisting it at the same time. I found myself studying the subtle details I had never noticed before, the way his fingers tapped lightly against the armrest, the quiet clench and release of his jaw, the barely perceptible rise and fall of his chest. Every movement felt loaded, every gesture a silent confession. There was a vulnerability there that went beyond words, something raw and unpolished that made the air between us almost electric. I felt the pull of it, an irresistible gravity that was both terrifying and impossible to resist, and I realized that this night had already changed the landscape of our connection, leaving us both exposed in ways we hadn't anticipated. The lamplight flickered softly, casting long shadows across his face, and in that shifting light, I could see the turmoil reflected in his eyes. They were searching, hesitant, yet full of an intensity that caught me off guard. I felt the same tension mirrored in myself, a rush of emotions that were at once exhilarating and daunting. The silence stretched heavy and intimate, and in it I became acutely aware of the small sounds around us, the faint rustle of fabric as he shifted, the soft creak of the chair, the subtle sighs that seemed to escape without conscious thought. It was a delicate balance, a fragile equilibrium, and every moment felt charged with the weight of what had already passed and what could never be undone. I noticed his gaze lift, meeting mine, and in that instant, time seemed to slow. The emotions that had been simmering beneath the surface spilled over in a quiet, unspoken acknowledgement of the bond that had shifted irrevocably. There was a tension in the space between us, taut like a thread stretched to its limit, carrying with it a mixture of longing, regret, and a strange sense of inevitability. The room felt almost suspended in time, every detail, the faint scent of rain, the warmth radiating between us, the soft golden glow, amplified by the intensity of our shared awareness. Even as the night wore on, the weight of what had transpired lingered, settling into our movements, our thoughts, and the air itself. It was impossible to ignore the impact, the subtle but undeniable change in the way we existed in the same space. Every glance, every gesture carried the memory of that tension, and a quiet understanding took root. Nothing would ever feel exactly the same again, and in that fragile, lingering stillness, I realized that some moments, once lived, leave their mark not in grand gestures or loud confessions, but in the quiet, persistent echo of emotions that refuse to be forgotten.